It was a crisp Tuesday morning in Montgomery, Alabama, when Brigadier General Robert Hayes pulled his car into the parking lot of St. Matthew's Baptist Church. The autumn leaves crunched under his polished black military shoes as he stepped out, adjusting his dress uniform one final time. The navy blue fabric was pristine, decorated with ribbons and medals that told the story of 25 years of dedicated service to his country. Robert had driven 6 hours from Fort Bragg to be here today. This wasn't just any funeral. It was for Reverend William Carter, the man who had shaped his entire life's direction. The same man who had sat with a troubled teenage boy in this very church parking lot 30 years ago, talking about purpose, discipline, and the possibilities that lay beyond the neighborhood's struggles. The church bell chimed softly in the distance, mixing with the sound of car doors closing as more people arrived. Robert could see familiar faces from his childhood, Mrs. Johnson, from down the street, who used to give him extra cookies when he'd help carry her groceries. There was Coach Peterson, his old high school football coach, walking with a slight limp now, but still carrying himself with that same proud posture. As Robert walked toward the church entrance, he noticed something unusual. Police cars were stationed at various points around the block, more than he'd ever seen for a funeral in this quiet neighborhood. The sight made him pause for a moment. In his years of military service, he'd learned to read situations quickly, and something about this felt off. Inside one of the patrol cars sat Officer Danny Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the Montgomery Police Department. Mitchell had been assigned to traffic control, but his attention wasn't on the flow of cars. Instead, he was focused on the people entering the church, his eyes narrowing as he watched Robert approach the building. Mitchell had grown up in a different part of Montgomery, in a household where certain attitudes about race and authority had been passed down like family heirlooms. Despite years of diversity training and department policies, those deep-seated beliefs still influenced how he saw the world. When he looked at Robert, he didn't see a decorated military officer. He saw what his conditioning had taught him to see, a threat that needed to be managed. The church was packed to capacity. Robert had expected a good turnout, but this was overwhelming. Reverend Carter had touched so many lives over his 40 years of ministry. The pews were filled with people from all walks of life: teachers, mechanics, nurses, retirees, young families with children who fidgeted in their Sunday best. Robert found a seat near the back, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He'd learned over the years that sometimes his uniform attracted more notice than he preferred, especially in civilian settings. Today was about honoring Reverend Carter, not about his own military achievements. The service was beautiful and heartfelt. Speaker after speaker shared stories about how Reverend Carter had changed their lives. Mrs. Patterson talked about how he'd helped her family when her husband lost his job. Young Tommy Wilson, now a successful engineer, spoke about the after-school program that had kept him off the streets. When it was Robert's turn to speak, he walked to the front with quiet dignity. The church fell silent as he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom remembered him as little Bobby Hayes, the kid who sometimes came to church with torn shoes and a rumbling stomach. Reverend Carter saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, Robert began, his voice steady but emotional. When I was 17 and heading down the wrong path, he didn't lecture me about my mistakes. Instead, he showed me a different way forward. He talked to me about service, about honor, about making a difference in the world. The congregation listened intently as Robert shared how Reverend Carter had encouraged him to consider the military, how the Reverend had even driven him to the recruitment office when Robert didn't have transportation. He told me that leadership isn't about commanding others, it's about serving others. That lesson has guided me through every day of my military career. Outside, Officer Mitchell was growing impatient. The funeral was running longer than expected, and he was supposed to be managing traffic flow. But there wasn't much traffic to manage. Most of the neighborhood had come to pay their respects, leaving the streets unusually quiet. Mitchell's radio crackled with routine chatter from other officers around the city, a fender bender on the interstate, a noise complaint in the suburbs, nothing that required his attention. He found himself studying the people coming and going from the church, making mental notes about who belonged and who didn't. As the service concluded, people began filing out of the church. Robert lingered inside, taking a moment to say a private goodbye to his mentor. The casket was covered in flowers, and Robert placed his hand gently on the polished wood. "Thank you for everything, Reverend," he whispered. "I hope I've made you proud." When Robert finally emerged from the church, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. People were gathered in small groups on the sidewalk and in the parking lot, sharing memories and catching up with old friends. This was the part of funerals that Robert had always found comforting, the way communities came together to celebrate a life well lived. He was approached by David Carter, the Reverend's son who had grown up alongside Robert in the church youth group. David was now a successful doctor, but he still had that same warm smile that Robert remembered from their childhood. General Hayes," David said with a grin. "It's so good to see you. Dad would have been so proud to know. You made it here today?" "Wouldn't have missed it," Robert replied, embracing his old friend. "Your father changed my life. The least I could do was be here to honor his memory." They talked for several minutes about old times, about the changes in the neighborhood, about their families and careers. Other childhood friends joined the conversation, people who had known Robert before he became a general. Back when he was just Bobby from 3rd Street, the gathering was warm and natural, the kind of community connection that Robert had missed. During his years of military service, these were his roots, his foundation. The people who had shaped him before the Army took over that role. From his patrol car, Officer Mitchell watched the groups of people with growing suspicion. He couldn't quite put his finger on what bothered him about the scene, but something felt wrong to him. The laughter seemed too loud, the gathering too relaxed. In his experience, groups of people could quickly turn into problems that needed his intervention. Mitchell had been involved in several controversial incidents over his 15-year career. Complaints had been filed against him for excessive force, for racial profiling, for inappropriate conduct during routine stops. Each time, he'd been cleared by internal investigations or given minor disciplinary actions. Each time, he'd convinced himself that he was just doing his job in a dangerous world. As the crowd began to thin out, Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out of his patrol car and began walking toward the church, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. In his mind, he was being proactive, maintaining order, doing what needed to be done. Robert was still talking with David and a few other friends when he noticed the police officer approaching. Something about the officer's body language, the rigid posture, the purposeful stride, the way his right hand hovered near his weapon, triggered Robert's military training. This wasn't a casual approach. This was someone preparing for confrontation. The afternoon was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Least of all, Robert, who had come simply to pay his respects to the man who had saved his life all those years ago. Officer Danny Mitchell's footsteps echoed against the concrete as he walked toward the group of people gathered outside St. Matthew's Baptist Church. His heart was beating faster than usual, pumped up by a mixture of adrenaline and something else he couldn't quite name. In his 15 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling him that something wasn't right about this scene. Robert was in the middle of sharing a funny story about Reverend Carter when he noticed the approaching officer. His military training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times, and the way this cop was moving set off alarm bells in his head. The officer's shoulders were tense, his jaw was set, and his right hand kept twitching toward his service weapon. "Excuse me for just a second," Robert said quietly to David and the others, turning to face the approaching officer with the same calm composure he'd used in countless military situations. Mitchell stopped about 10 feet away from the group, his eyes locked on Robert's uniform. The sight of all those medals and ribbons should have commanded respect, but instead it triggered something darker in Mitchell's mind. He'd grown up hearing stories from his father and uncles about people who didn't deserve the honors they wore, about outsiders who tried to claim status they hadn't earned. "Hey, you!" Mitchell called out, his voice carrying an edge that made several people in the group look up nervously. Yeah, you in the uniform. I need to talk to you. Robert took a small step forward, separating himself from his friends to avoid involving them in whatever was about to happen. Good afternoon, officer, he said respectfully, keeping his voice level and professional. Is there something I can help you with? Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he studied Robert more closely. The uniform looked real enough, but in his experience, people could buy anything online these days. Military surplus stores sold all kinds of gear to wannabes and pretenders. Where'd you get that uniform? He demanded, his tone becoming more aggressive. The question caught Robert off guard. In all his years of service, no one had ever questioned the authenticity of his uniform. I'm sorry, what? He asked, genuinely confused by the officer's hostile approach. You heard me, Mitchell snapped, taking another step closer. That's a military uniform you're wearing. I want to know where you got it and what gives you the right to wear it. David Carter, who had been listening to the exchange with growing concern, stepped forward. Officer, this is General Robert Hayes. He's been serving our country for 25 years. He gave a beautiful speech at my father's funeral today. Mitchell's face flushed red at what he perceived as interference from a civilian. I wasn't talking to you, he barked at David. Step back and let me handle this. Robert raised his hand slightly, signaling David to stay calm. Officer, I'm Brigadier General Robert Hayes, United States Army. I have my military identification if you'd like to see it. He spoke slowly and clearly, the way he'd been trained to communicate in tense situations, but Mitchell was beyond listening to reason. The combination of his deep-seated prejudices, his need to assert authority, and his growing embarrassment at the situation he'd created was clouding his judgment completely. Don't move, he shouted, his hand flying to his service weapon. I think you're impersonating a military officer, and that's a federal crime. The sound of Mitchell's weapon being drawn sent a shock wave through the crowd. People who had been chatting peacefully just moments before suddenly found themselves in the middle of a dangerous confrontation. Several women screamed, children began crying, and men instinctively moved to protect their families. Robert felt his blood run cold as he found himself staring down the barrel of a police officer's gun. In all his years of military service, including 3 combat tours overseas, he'd faced enemy fire with courage and determination. But this was different. This was happening in his hometown, outside the church where he'd grown up, surrounded by people he'd known his whole life. Officer, please listen to me, Robert said, his voice steady despite the weapon pointed at his chest. I am a serving general in the United States Army. My identification is in my jacket pocket. If you'll allow me, I can show you my credentials. Mitchell's finger hovered near the trigger as he tried to process what was happening. Part of him was beginning to realize that he might have made a terrible mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Too many people were watching. Too many phones were being pulled out to record the incident. Get on the ground, Mitchell yelled, his voice cracking slightly. Get on the ground right now. The crowd was growing larger as people from neighboring houses came out to see what the commotion was about. Mrs. Johnson, who had known Robert since he was a little boy, pushed through the crowd with tears in her eyes. That's Bobby Hayes, she shouted at the officer. I've known that boy his whole life. He's a war hero. Coach Peterson, despite his bad leg, also stepped forward. Officer, you're making a mistake, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect from young people. That man has served this country with honor. He's got more medals than you've got years on the force. But Mitchell was too far gone to listen to the voices of reason around him. The situation had spiraled completely out of his control, and his training had failed him. Instead of de-escalating the confrontation, he was making it worse with every passing second. Robert slowly raised his hands, his military bearing evident even in this humiliating situation. Officer Mitchell, he said, reading the nameplate on the man's uniform. I'm going to speak very slowly and clearly. My name is Brigadier General Robert Hayes. I have served in the United States Army for 25 years. I have completed 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. I am here today to attend the funeral of Reverend William Carter, who was my mentor and friend. The mention of the Reverend's name sent another wave of anger through the crowd. These were people who had loved and respected their pastor, and seeing his funeral disrupted by this confrontation was adding fuel to an already explosive situation. David Carter, his face flushed with anger and disbelief, pulled out his cell phone and began recording. "This is insane," he said, his voice shaking. "Officer, that man is a decorated war veteran. He's protecting your freedom while you're pointing a gun at him." Mitchell noticed the phones being raised around him, the recording lights blinking red. Social media had become a cop's worst nightmare, and he knew that whatever happened here would be online within minutes. But he'd gone too far to back down now without losing face completely. "I said get on the ground," he repeated, his voice getting higher and more desperate. "I don't care what you people are saying. I'm investigating a possible case of stolen valor, and I'm going to do my job." Robert remained standing, his hands visible but not on the ground. His military training had taught him about dignity under fire, about maintaining composure even in the most challenging circumstances. He would not get on the ground like a criminal, not in front of these people who had known him since childhood. The standoff continued, with Mitchell's weapon trained on an innocent man while a crowd of witnesses watched in horror and disbelief. The afternoon sun beat down on the scene, and the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. As someone had called for backup, what had started as a peaceful gathering to honor a beloved community leader had turned into a nightmare that would soon capture the attention of the entire nation. The sound of sirens grew louder as more police units responded to what dispatch had described as an "officer needs assistance" call. But the first person to arrive wasn't another patrol officer. It was Sergeant Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran who had been driving nearby when she heard Mitchell's radio chatter. Williams pulled up to the scene and immediately knew something was very wrong. She could see her fellow officer with his weapon drawn, pointing it at a man in what appeared to be a genuine military dress uniform. The crowd around them was agitated and growing larger by the minute, with at least a dozen people holding up their phones to record everything. As she stepped out of her patrol car, Williams caught sight of the ribbons and medals on Robert's uniform. Her own father had served in Vietnam, and she knew military decorations when she saw them. These weren't costume pieces or replicas, they were the real deal, earned through years of service and sacrifice. "Danny, what's the situation here?" she called out, trying to keep her voice calm and professional as she approached the standoff. Mitchell's eyes darted toward his sergeant, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "Sergeant, I've got a suspected case of stolen valor here. This individual is wearing military insignia that I believe he's not authorized to wear." Williams moved closer, studying Robert's uniform more carefully. The combat infantry badge, the Bronze Star, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, these were serious decorations that told the story of genuine military service. Her trained eye could also see the quality of the uniform itself, the way it fit, the proper placement of every element. This wasn't some Halloween costume or surplus store purchase. "Officer Mitchell," she said firmly, "I need you to lower your weapon right now." "But Sergeant, I'm in the middle of an investigation." "Lower your weapon, Danny. That's an order." The crowd watched tensely as Mitchell hesitated, clearly torn between his pride and his duty to follow orders from a superior. Robert remained perfectly still, his hands raised, his expression calm despite the extraordinary circumstances he found himself in. Mrs. Johnson, who had been watching from the front of the crowd, couldn't contain herself any longer. "Officer Williams," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taught Sunday school for 40 years. "That's Bobby Hayes. I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His mama brought him to this very church every Sunday." Other voices joined in from the crowd. "He's been in the Army for 25 years, shouted Coach Peterson. "He's a general now," added another voice. "He spoke at the funeral today, gave the most beautiful tribute to Reverend Carter." Williams held up her hand to quiet the crowd while keeping her eyes on Mitchell. "Danny, these people are telling you who this man is. Look at his uniform. Look at those decorations." Do you really think someone would fake that level of detail just to attend a funeral? Mitchell's resolve was beginning to crumble, but his pride kept him from admitting his mistake. People fake military service all the time, Sergeant. I've seen it before. Just because he's got a fancy uniform doesn't mean he earned the right to wear it. David Carter, who had been recording the entire incident on his phone, stepped forward carefully. Officer Williams, I'm David Carter. This is my father's funeral that just ended. General Hayes and I grew up together in this church. He's been serving our country since we were teenagers. I can vouch for him completely. Williams nodded at David, then turned back to Mitchell. Danny, I'm ordering you one more time to holster your weapon. This situation is completely out of control, and you're making it worse every second you keep that gun pointed at this man. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. More police cars were arriving, their sirens adding to the chaos of the scene. Robert could see the flashing lights reflecting off the church windows, and he couldn't help but think about how disappointed Reverend Carter would have been to see his funeral aftermath turn into something like this. Officer Mitchell, Robert said quietly, his voice carrying despite the noise around them. I understand you're trying to do your job, but I need you to understand something. I've been shot at by enemy combatants in Afghanistan. I've had rockets fired at my position. I've seen things that would give you nightmares, but I've never been more afraid than I am right now, standing in front of the church where I grew up, having a gun pointed at me by someone who's supposed to protect and serve this community. The raw honesty in Robert's words cut through the tension like a blade. Several people in the crowd began to cry, and even some of the newly arrived officers looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Mitchell's hand was shaking now, and Williams could see that he was beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. Danny, think about what you're doing, she said softly. Think about how this looks. Think about how this is going to end. The crowd had grown to over 50 people now, with more arriving every minute. Word was spreading through the neighborhood. Like wildfire, Bobby Hayes, their local hero, was being held at gunpoint by a police officer outside his childhood church. The phones recording the incident were streaming live to social media platforms, and the hashtags were already starting to trend. Tommy Wilson, the young engineer who had spoken at the funeral about Reverend Carter's after-school program, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. Officer, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're making the biggest mistake of your career. That man has more honor in his little finger than most people have in their whole body. Williams could see the situation spiraling further out of control with each passing moment. The crowd was getting angrier, more officers were arriving without understanding the full context, and social media was amplifying everything in real time. She knew that whatever happened next would be scrutinized by millions of people within hours. Everyone please step back and give us some space, she announced to the crowd. We're going to resolve this situation peacefully. But even as she spoke, those words, Williams wasn't sure how they were going to get out of this mess. Mitchell had painted himself into a corner, and his pride was preventing him from taking the obvious way out. The community was rightfully outraged, and their anger was justified. And at the center of it all stood a decorated war hero, who had done nothing wrong except attend his mentor's funeral. Robert continued to stand with quiet dignity, his military bearing evident even in this humiliating situation. He thought about the young soldiers he had commanded over the years, how he had always taught them that character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in moments of trial. Right now, his character was being tested in front of his entire hometown community. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the church parking lot. What should have been a peaceful farewell to a beloved community leader had turned into a nightmare that would soon capture national attention. And at the center of it all, Officer Danny Mitchell still had his weapon drawn, pointing it at an innocent man whose only crime was wearing the uniform he had earned through decades of faithful service to his country. The standoff continued, with dozens of witnesses, multiple cameras rolling, and the weight of justice hanging in the balance. Something had to give, and everyone present knew that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but possibly the course of several lives forever. The tension outside St. Matthew's Baptist Church reached its breaking point when a sleek black government vehicle pulled up to the scene. The crowd turned to watch as two figures in military dress uniforms stepped out of the sedan, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement with the kind of precision that only came from years of military discipline. Colonel James Rodriguez emerged from the driver's side, his uniform displaying the same level of decoration and distinction as Robert's. Behind him came Major Lisa Thompson, a decorated officer with multiple combat deployments under her belt. They had been driving to the airport after attending the funeral, when they received an urgent call from a mutual friend who had seen the confrontation unfolding on social media. Rodriguez surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had commanded troops in some of the world's most dangerous places. He could see his longtime colleague and friend standing with his hands raised, a police officer's weapon trained on him, while a crowd of agitated civilians watched from a safe distance. This was the kind of situation that could explode into violence if not handled properly. "What in God's name is happening here?" Rodriguez said loudly enough for everyone to hear as he approached the confrontation. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Without question, Sergeant Williams turned toward the approaching officers, relief evident on her face. Here were people who could verify Robert's identity and credentials beyond any doubt. "Colonel, we have a situation here where one of my officers has drawn his weapon on this gentleman, believing he might be impersonating a military officer." Rodriguez looked at Mitchell with barely concealed disgust. "Officer, you are pointing a weapon at Brigadier General Robert Hayes, United States Army. He is one of the most decorated officers I have ever served with, and he has spent the better part of 3 decades defending the freedom that allows you to carry that badge." Major Thompson stepped forward, her own credentials clearly visible on her uniform. "General Hayes commanded me during my first deployment to Afghanistan. He saved my life and the lives of countless other soldiers. If you don't lower that weapon immediately, you're going to have a very serious problem with the United States military." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as the truth of Robert's identity was confirmed by his fellow officers. People began shouting, "We told you so!" and "Put that gun away." The energy of the crowd was shifting from fear and anger to vindication and outrage at the injustice they were witnessing. Mitchell's face had gone completely pale. The presence of 2 additional high-ranking military officers confirming Robert's identity left no room for doubt about the enormity of his mistake. But his pride and fear of humiliation were still preventing him from doing the right thing. I was just trying to verify," Mitchell stammered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "Verify what?" Rodriguez snapped. "Are you an expert on military uniforms? Do you know the difference between a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart? Can you tell me what it takes to earn a combat infantry badge?" His voice was rising with each question, his anger at the situation becoming more evident. Mrs. Johnson, emboldened by the arrival of Robert's colleagues, stepped even closer to the confrontation. "Young man," she said to Mitchell, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had lived through decades of social change in the South, "I watched that boy grow up in this church. I saw him struggle and succeed. I watched him leave for the Army as a teenager and come back as a man of honor. You should be ashamed of yourself." David Carter, still recording everything on his phone, looked at the view counter on his live stream and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Over 10,000 people were watching in real time, and the numbers were climbing rapidly. Comments were pouring in from across the country, with people expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Coach Peterson, leaning heavily on his walking cane, made his way to the front of the crowd. "Officer, I've been coaching young people for 40 years. I know character when I see it. Bobby Hayes has more character than anyone I've ever met. You're making a fool of yourself and embarrassing this entire community." Major Thompson pulled out her military identification and held it up for Mitchell to see. "Officer, I am Major Lisa Thompson, United States Army. This is my identification, and this is Colonel Rodriguez's identification." We are both confirming that the man you have your weapon pointed at is exactly who he says he is. There is no stolen valor here. There is no impersonation. There is only a decorated war hero trying to attend his mentor's funeral in peace. The sound of more vehicles arriving caught everyone's attention. News vans from local television stations were pulling up, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky. Reporters and camera crews were setting up their equipment, drawn by the social media buzz that was making this story go viral across the country. Rodriguez could see the media arriving and knew that this situation was about to become a national story. "Officer Mitchell," he said, using the name he had read from the man's badge. "In about 5 minutes, this is going to be on every news channel in America. Right now you have a choice. You can end this with whatever dignity you have left, or you can continue to point that weapon at a war hero and become the poster boy for everything that's wrong with policing in this country." Mitchell looked around at the crowd, at the cameras, at the military officers, and finally at Robert, who had maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal. For the first time, Mitchell seemed to truly see the man he had been threatening, not as a threat to be controlled, but as a human being who deserved respect. Tommy Wilson, who had spoken at the funeral earlier, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "Officer, do you have any idea what this man has done for our country? Do you know how many young soldiers are alive today because of his leadership? Do you understand that you're pointing a gun at someone who has risked his life countless times to protect yours?" The weight of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate Mitchell's defensive wall of pride and prejudice. He could see the disappointment and anger in the faces around him. He could hear the comments from the live streams that people were watching on their phones. He could see his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes. Sergeant Williams, who had been trying to de-escalate the situation for what felt like hours, made one final attempt to get through to her subordinate. "Danny, I've known you for 8 years. You're not a bad person, but you've made a terrible mistake here. The only way to make this right is to lower your weapon, apologize to General Hayes, and hope that he's gracious enough to accept it." Robert, who had remained silent during most of the exchanges, finally spoke. "Officer Mitchell, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm disappointed and I'm hurt, but I don't hate you. We all make mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's how they handle those mistakes when they realize they've made them." The grace and dignity in Robert's words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Here was a man who had been humiliated and threatened, showing more class and character than the person who had wronged him. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more powerful. As the cameras rolled and the crowd watched, everyone waited to see what Officer Mitchell would do next. The moment of truth had arrived, and the entire nation was about to witness whether justice would prevail or if this shameful confrontation would continue. The wailing sirens of another vehicle cut through the afternoon air, but this time it wasn't just another patrol car. Police Chief Robert Anderson's unmarked SUV came to an abrupt stop at the edge of the crowd, and the veteran law enforcement officers stepped out with the kind of urgency that comes from knowing your department is about to face a crisis of epic proportions. Chief Anderson had been in his office reviewing budget reports when his phone started buzzing with calls from city council members, the mayor's office, and even the governor's press secretary. Social media was exploding with videos of one of his officers holding a decorated war hero at gunpoint, and the story was spreading faster than wildfire across every platform imaginable. The chief was a former Marine himself, having served 2 tours in Iraq before joining the police force 20 years ago. He understood military culture, respected military service, and knew exactly what he was looking at when he saw Robert standing there in his dress uniform with his hands raised. "What in the hell is going on here?" Chief Anderson's voice boomed across the parking lot as he approached the scene. Every officer present snapped to attention. They all knew that tone, and it meant someone was about to face serious consequences. Sergeant Williams quickly stepped forward to brief her superior. Chief Officer Mitchell drew his weapon on this gentleman, believing he was impersonating a military officer. We've since had multiple confirmations that he is indeed Brigadier General Robert Hayes, United States Army. Chief Anderson looked at Mitchell with barely controlled fury, then turned to Robert and rendered a sharp military salute. General Hayes, on behalf of the Montgomery Police Department and the City of Montgomery, I offer you my sincere and humble apologies for this inexcusable treatment. Robert slowly lowered his hands for the first time in nearly an hour and returned the salute with the dignity that had defined his entire military career. Thank you, Chief Anderson. I appreciate your response to this situation. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, with many people wiping tears from their eyes. Mrs. Johnson was openly weeping, overwhelmed by the relief of seeing justice finally beginning to prevail. Coach Peterson pumped his fist in the air despite his bad leg, and David Carter continued to stream everything live as the viewer count climbed past 50,000 people. Chief Anderson turned back to Mitchell, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Officer Mitchell, holster your weapon immediately. That's a direct order from your chief of police. Mitchell's hand was shaking as he finally, slowly, returned his service weapon to its holster. The simple action that should have happened an hour ago felt like it took forever, but when it was complete, a collective sigh of relief went up from the crowd. Danny, Chief Anderson continued, his voice cold and professional, you are hereby suspended from duty pending a full investigation into this incident. You will report to Internal Affairs first thing Monday morning. Until then, you are relieved of your badge and weapon. The public nature of Mitchell's suspension sent another cheer through the crowd. People were recording everything, and within minutes, videos of the chief taking decisive action were being shared across social media platforms with captions like, "This is how you handle bad cops," and "Justice in real time." Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward and addressed Chief Anderson directly. Chief, I want you to know that General Hayes is one of the finest officers I've ever served with. He saved countless lives, led men and women in combat, and has dedicated his entire adult life to serving this country. What happened here today is not just an assault on him personally. It's an assault on everything our military stands for. Major. Thompson nodded in agreement. General Hayes has 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and more commendations than I can count. He's trained hundreds of officers, led thousands of soldiers, and never once in his entire career has his integrity or character been questioned. The news crews that had arrived were capturing every word, and reporters were already preparing their stories for the evening broadcasts. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It was becoming a national conversation about racial profiling. Respect for veterans and police accountability. David Carter, who had been streaming the entire incident live, looked at his phone in amazement. The video had been shared over 1,000 times in just the past few minutes, and comments were pouring in from people across the country expressing outrage at what they had witnessed, and support for Robert. Chief Anderson pulled out his own phone and made a quick call. Mayor Thompson, this is Chief Anderson. Yes, sir, I'm at the scene now. The situation is under control, but we need to discuss our response strategy immediately. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Yes, sir, the officer has been suspended. We'll have a full statement ready within the hour. Tommy Wilson, still emotional from everything he had witnessed, approached Robert directly. General Hayes, I just want you to know that what happened here today doesn't represent our community. We know who you are, we know what you've done for our country, and we're honored to have you as one of our own. Robert's response showed the same grace he had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. Tommy, I know this community. I grew up here. I know the good people who live here, and I know that Officer Mitchell's actions don't reflect the values that Reverend Carter taught us in this church. Mrs. Johnson made her way through the crowd and embraced Robert like the grandmother she had been to him throughout his childhood. Bobby, I am so sorry about what happened today. That officer should be ashamed of himself. Mrs. Johnson, Robert replied, hugging her back. Reverend Carter always taught us to respond to hatred with love, to respond to ignorance with education. That's what I'm going to try to do. Chief Anderson overheard Robert's response and was struck by the man's character. In his 20 years of law enforcement, he had seen how people typically reacted to being wronged by police officers. The fact that Robert was talking about education rather than revenge spoke volumes about his integrity. The chief made a decision that would define his own legacy. General Hayes, I would like to personally invite you to participate in our police training programs. We clearly have work to do in terms of educating our officers about respect, dignity, and proper protocol. Your voice and your experience could help us become a better department. The offer surprised everyone, including Robert. It was one thing to apologize for what had happened, but it was another thing entirely to take proactive steps to prevent it from happening again. Coach Peterson, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped forward one more time. You know what, Bobby? Your mama would be proud of how you handled yourself today, and Reverend Carter would be proud too. You showed more class in the past hour than most people show in a lifetime. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, the full impact of what had happened was beginning to sink in. The videos were going viral, news outlets across the country were picking up the story, and by evening the hashtag Justice for General Hayes was trending nationally. Mitchell, now stripped of his badge and weapon, walked silently to his patrol car. Under the watchful eyes of his fellow officers and the community members who had witnessed his disgraceful behavior, his 15-year career was effectively over. And he knew it, but even as justice was being served, Robert Hayes stood in the parking lot of his childhood church, surrounded by people who loved and respected him, thinking not about revenge or lawsuits, but about how this experience could be used to make positive change in his community and beyond. The afternoon that had started with a funeral to honor one great man had ended with another great man, showing the entire country what true character looks like under pressure.